Who gets to negotiate the end of a war? It sounds like a simple question, right? Obviously, the country's fighting it. But in modern global diplomacy, actually securing a seat at that metaphorical negotiating table, well, that can be just as fiercely contested as the battlefield itself. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the intense geopolitical maneuvering surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war, and specifically, we're looking at a massive debate that just erupted among the world's most powerful leaders.
We're setting the scene at the 52nd G7 summit, which just went down in Evian-les-Bains, France. Now, what was supposed to be your standard gathering of advanced economies completely transformed. It turned into this high-stakes diplomatic debate over who actually gets a seat at the peace table to end the war in Ukraine. Like, will it just be the warring nations and a mediator, or will the countries who have been funding the defense demand their own chairs?
So to understand why this debate is blowing up right now, we kind of have to look at the immediate timeline. Just recently, a 60-day US-Iran ceasefire was reached. And that's huge, because it essentially cleared up a ton of diplomatic bandwidth for the United States. With that conflict paused, the global spotlight snapped right back to Ukraine. Fast forward to Sunday, which also happened to be Donald Trump's 80th birthday, and the president made separate phone calls to Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. By Monday, as the G7 summit kicked off in France, the stage was totally set for a major showdown over how these peace talks should actually work.
Okay, Section 1. The U.S. and Ukrainian visions.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp the friction at the G7, we first need to look at how these two nations have very different goals for the mediation process. President Trump's vision? He wants the U.S. to act primarily as a neutral dealmaker. His administration is pushing hard for a rapid resolution. Why? Well, partly to lift economic sanctions on Russia so that massive global infrastructure projects, like the proposed Alaska-Siberia tunnel, can actually move forward. But on the flip side, President Zelensky strongly insists that the U.S. cannot just be a neutral messenger passing notes back and forth. Ukraine's vision requires the U.S. to act as an active, supportive mediator that firmly backs Kyiv's security interests.
And the reason Zelensky is pushing for supportive mediation rather than just a quick, neutral compromise is that he truly believes Ukraine is negotiating from a position of strength. Just look at this quote he delivered to the G7 leaders. He plainly stated, "Russia is not winning and is losing a lot of people. It must therefore reach an agreement as quickly as possible. They do not have the initiative in their hands." He's actively making the case to the global community that Ukraine is not losing on the battlefield anymore, and therefore absolutely shouldn't be rushed into unfavorable terms.
And to back up that claim of strength, Zelensky pointed to some very tangible recent events. Get this, specific detail. Ukrainian drone strikes recently ignited Moscow's largest oil refinery, and that facility is literally just 9 miles from the Kremlin. 9 miles! That is a crucial piece of leverage. By showing they can strike that deep into Russian territory, Ukraine is signaling to the U.S. and the rest of the G7 that they are fully empowered to demand a structured, supportive peace process, not just a quick exit ramp.
Which brings us to Section 2. Europe demands a seat.
Now, the U.S. and Ukraine obviously aren't the only ones with a massive stake in this. As the summit in Evian went on, this huge secondary conflict bubbled up. French President Emmanuel Macron, who was hosting the summit, laid out Europe's demand unequivocally. His quote says it all. The right negotiation is one in which Ukraine and Russia are at the table, but with Europeans and Americans present as well. He is flat out rejecting the idea of a bilateral negotiation brokered solely by the United States. Europe wants in the room.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer weight of Europe's justification. Like, why are they demanding this seat so strongly? Well, as U.S. aid has shifted, European nations are the ones providing almost all the financial and military support that's keeping Kyiv afloat right now. On top of that, the EU is currently prepping its 21st package of sanctions against Russia, which includes some heavy restrictions on liquid natural gas tankers. And, of course, you can't ignore the geography. A destabilized Eastern Europe is a direct threat to the entire continent. They've poured massive investments into this conflict, and they have a very real, deep fear of being sidelined when it's finally resolved.
Driving this demand on behalf of Europe is a very specific coalition. You'll often hear them referred to as the E3. This is the diplomatic heavyweight group made up of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz at the helm. The E3 is trying to spearhead a unified bloc. Their goal is simple: ensure European interests are hardwired into whatever final peace treaty gets signed.
Moving right along to Section 3, who speaks for Europe?
Now, this brings us to a really complicated internal roadblock for the continent. If Europe does successfully demand a seat at the table, who actually gets to sit in it? Initially, the idea was to appoint a single, special European envoy to represent everyone's interests. But finding a consensus candidate? Yeah, that's incredibly difficult. Take Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland. His name was floated as a possibility, but he firmly rejected the role. He went on the record saying, "Personally, I do not see myself as a representative in this matter. I believe this should be led by the major players, namely France, Germany, and the UK." So just like that, the responsibility gets pushed right back onto the shoulders of the E3.
So the reality right now is that European diplomats are scrambling to solve this representation dilemma before the autumn, which is when they're hoping talks might actually begin. Their current strategy basically boils down to 2 steps. Step 1, they are urgently trying to identify a heavyweight political figure, probably a former prime minister, who commands enough global respect to act as a unified envoy. Step 2, they need to rapidly consolidate the E3's strategies so they can present a totally united front when they negotiate directly with the US, Russia, and Ukraine.
All right, Section 4, Russia rejects European involvement.
But here's the catch. All of Europe's frantic preparations might just hit a massive brick wall when we look at the other primary combatant. Moscow's reaction has been a swift and harsh rejection. Kirill Dmitriev, who is Vladimir Putin's special representative, took to social media during the G7 to vehemently push back against European inclusion. He actually labeled the potential presence of the EU and the UK as warmongering poison pills to derail peace discussions, and accused them of pushing tired, unrealistic solutions. Russia's stance is crystal clear here. They want to exclude Europe entirely from the negotiating room.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer complexity of the situation we're currently facing. Just look at this breakdown of the stakeholders. It's almost like a giant puzzle. The US wants to be a neutral deal-maker for a rapid resolution. Ukraine wants to be a direct negotiator, but backed by a supportive mediator to ensure its actual survival. Europe demands to be a direct negotiator to protect its massive financial and military investments, plus its border security. And Russia? They want a strictly bilateral negotiation that explicitly excludes Europe. Everyone wants to control the shape of the table before they even sit down to discuss the shape of the peace.
Which brings us to the ultimate unknown, hanging over the international community following this G7 summit. As autumn approaches and the pressure to end the fighting really intensifies, what is that room actually going to look like? Will the peace table have 3 seats or 5? Who gets to decide the future of Eastern Europe? It is a fascinating diplomatic puzzle and one that's going to define the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on how this incredible story develops.